A journalist witnesses a child crying while trying to remove shoes that hurt her, before an absent father and a smiling stepmother. Suspicious of the scene, she begins a silent investigation into the seemingly perfect family. She uncovers signs of emotional abuse, silencing and manipulation carefully hidden. Her investigation sparks a battle between power and truth, where the rescue of a childhood is at stake. The afternoon sun reflected off the display windows of Westfield Mall in London as Helen Sawyer adjusted the strap of her bag where she kept her recorder and notepad. At 35, with over a decade in the newsroom of the London Chronicle, the investigative reporter had become known for stories that gave a voice to the invisible. That Tuesday, she only intended to interview the new mall manager for an article about luxury commerce during the economic crisis. It was then she heard it. A suppressed cry, different from the typical wailing of spoiled children. At the exit of Tiffany & Co., a girl of approximately 7, dressed in an impeccable uniform from St. Augustine's Academy, was crouched down trying to pull off the red patent leather shoes she was wearing. "Daddy, it's tight, it hurts," the little girl murmured, her face red from crying so much. Helen observed the man in an Italian suit, incessantly checking his wristwatch. Beside him, a woman with perfectly straightened hair, a designer dress and a Prada bag held shopping bags. "Sophie, stop this drama now. People are staring," the woman said, adjusting her sunglasses and looking around with a forced smile. "But, Claudia, maybe the shoe really is tight," the man commented, hesitant. "Richard, don't start. We just bought them, they're the right size. She's just being difficult because she wants those horrible light-up sneakers." The journalist noticed something unsettling. The woman smiled at acquaintances passing by, waved, posed. But when she turned to the girl, her eyes became icy, distant. It was as if for an instant the mask fell. Helen had seen that face before. Claudia Vance, now Albright after marriage, a frequent figure in social columns, known for presiding over 3 charity foundations for underprivileged children. Her husband, Richard Albright, owned one of the country's largest construction companies. Helen's journalistic instinct flared when she saw the girl finally stand up, limping subtly in the shoes that clearly hurt her. The child's small hand was gripped with unnecessary force by her stepmother, who pulled her towards the exit, while the father followed a few steps behind, visibly uncomfortable but inert. Discreetly, Helen followed the family to the parking lot. Noting the license plate of the Porsche Cayenne, and the moment Sophie was practically pushed into the vehicle. Through the window she could see the girl huddled in the back seat, looking at her own feet with a look of defeat no child should carry. The next day, Helen arrived early at the newsroom. Her boss, Martha Lopez, found her immersed in research about the Albrights. "New project?" Martha asked, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing, maybe something." Information accumulated on the screen. Richard Albright, 45, heir to Albright Construction, estimated net worth of $250 million. Widowed 5 years ago. Remarried 3 years ago to Claudia Vance, 38. Former model and current president of the New Dawn Foundation. Happy Horizons and Children's Future Institute. In an old photo, Helen saw Sophie as a baby in her biological mother's lap. Beatrice Meadows, who had died in an accident. The child's expression was completely different. Lively, radiant, secure. A few more searches revealed that Sophie studied at St. Augustine's Academy, one of London's most expensive and traditional institutions. Helen closed her laptop and picked up the phone. An old college friend, Renee Oliver, was a pedagogical coordinator there. Perhaps she could help. That afternoon, the two met at a coffee shop far from the school. "I can't talk about specific students." "You know that," Renee said, stirring her coffee nervously. "I understand. But we're talking about a child potentially in danger." Renee sighed, looking around before speaking lower. "Look, I'm not confirming anything about any particular student, but as an educator, I can say we have protocols when we notice behavioral changes. When a child who was once outgoing becomes quiet. When drawings change from colorful to dark. When threatening figures appear where there were once only suns and flowers. And what do you do when you notice that? First, we try to talk to the child. Then we call the guardians. If necessary, we contact Child Protective Services, but sometimes it's complicated, especially with influential families. Helen understood the message. Renee couldn't say more, but she had said enough. If you ever need material for documentation, drawings are kept in the pedagogical archive. I'm just telling you this as general information. Leaving the coffee shop, Helen knew she needed more. She called Anthony Carter, a retired family lawyer who had been a source in previous reports. If you suspect abuse or neglect, you need proof, the lawyer explained in his book-filled office. Medical records, patterns of school absence, testimonies from close individuals. And be careful. Powerful families have resources to protect themselves and attack. Where do I start? With what you already have access to. Public records. Then look for former employees, people who worked in the house. And, of course, medical records if you can get them. The following week, Helen visited 3 private hospitals in South London. At St. Thomas's Hospital, a nurse named Carla, after much hesitation, confirmed with a discreet nod. I can't show patient files, but there was an admission about 3 months ago. Arm contusion, knee abrasions. The justification was fall down the stairs. The child was very quiet with signs of mild malnutrition. Most concerning were bruises at different stages of healing. And what was done? The doctor recorded everything, but the guardian was very convincing. Said the girl was clumsy, always falling. The father wasn't present. Helen wrote everything down in her notepad. The pieces were starting to fit, but it wasn't enough yet. She needed more. Through a search of judicial archives, she discovered 3 labor lawsuits against Claudia, all settled with confidential agreements. One of the names caught her attention, Zelda Smith, former housekeeper. Locating Zelda wasn't easy. The woman had moved to Canterbury, Kent, and was very reluctant before agreeing to talk. I'll only speak off the record, Zelda warned, sitting in the small kitchen of her apartment. I don't want trouble. That woman has contacts, power. I understand and respect your condition. What can you tell me about her interactions with Sophie? Zelda took a deep breath, her eyes moist. Mrs. Claudia has 2 faces. To the world, she's the perfect stepmother, the generous philanthropist, at home. It's another story. I never saw her hit the girl, not directly. But there were other kinds of cruelty. Control humiliations, deprivations. She made the little one wear tight clothes, left her without snacks if she didn't behave like a little lady. Once she made her stand in punishment for 3 hours because she spilled juice on the carpet. And the father? Absent. Always on trips, meetings. When he's home, he seems not to want to see. Mrs. Claudia manipulates everything, convinces him that Sophie is problematic, that she needs discipline. Helen felt a lump in her throat. The story was worse than she imagined. Is there anything more specific that can help me? When I left there, Sophie hugged me and asked to come along. Her look, that's not the look of a happy child. It's the look of someone living in fear. Returning to London that night, Helen noticed a dark car following her taxi. When she arrived at her apartment, there were 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. The next day, a gossip blog published an article questioning her credibility as a journalist. Someone knew she was investigating, and that someone wanted to stop her. But Helen Sawyer would not be easily intimidated, not when a child's well-being was at stake. The investigation was just beginning, and she already knew that what she would discover would be far darker than the tight red shoes at the mall. Helen wasn't surprised when her editor-in-chief, Paul Gordon, called her into his office the next morning. The middle-aged man adjusted his glasses on his nose, visibly uncomfortable. I received a call from Albright and Associates, he said, tapping his fingers on the desk. It seems you're investigating Richard Albright. Is that true? I'm investigating a possible case of child abuse, Helen replied, maintaining a steady gaze. The fact that it involves the Albright family is secondary. Paul sighed. Helen, do you know who the Albrights are? They have multi-million-pound advertising contracts with us. Claudia presides over 3 internationally recognized children's foundations, and that makes her immune to questioning. I thought we worked with journalism, not public relations. The editor took a deep breath, running a hand through his graying hair. Do you have concrete evidence? I'm gathering it. I have strong indications, but I need more time. 3 weeks, Paul conceded. No names published until we have something solid. And please be discreet. Helen smiled, grateful for the trust, however limited. She knew Paul was an old-school journalist who still believed in the transformative power of the press. Leaving the office, she met her colleague Deborah Miller, a reporter for the lifestyle section. "We need to talk," Deborah whispered, pulling her into the archives room. "I heard about your investigation. I have a cousin who works at the New Dawn Foundation. Things there aren't what they seem. There are rumors of embezzlement, of overpriced charity events." That would be consistent, Helen reflected. Abusive people often build impeccable public personas to deflect suspicion. That afternoon, Helen returned to St. Augustine's Academy, this time without looking for Renee. She positioned herself discreetly near the exit gate, pretending to wait for someone. Soon she spotted Sophie, leaving alone, her impeccable uniform contrasting with her downcast expression. The girl walked looking at the ground, holding her backpack tightly. A black car stopped. The door opened and Claudia stepped out, displaying a radiant smile upon seeing some known mothers. She approached Sophie, embracing her for society's invisible cameras. But Helen noticed the girl's rigidity, the way she subtly flinched. Using a discreet camera, Helen recorded the moment when, away from the gaze of other parents, Claudia squeezed Sophie's arm tightly, murmuring something that made the girl pale. In seconds, the maternal smile returned when a teacher approached to greet them. Helen noticed that a public security camera pointed directly at that entrance. Perhaps she could get the footage. That same night, her police informant, Sergeant Morris, managed to access the recordings from the last 30 days. Helen spent hours reviewing the material, documenting patterns. Claudia always smiling in public, always harsh when she believed herself unobserved. Sophie stumbling and receiving looks of disdain instead of care. Silent scoldings where only intimidating body language was visible. The next day, Helen arranged a meeting with Luke Fisher, a social worker from the local social services. "What you have is concerning," Luke stated after examining the notes and some images, "but insufficient for immediate intervention. Wealthy families have resources to defend themselves. We need more conclusive evidence to open an official investigation. What do you suggest?" "Keep documenting. Look for school records, absence patterns, documented behavioral changes. Meanwhile, I can initiate routine visits. The foundations presided over by Mrs. Albright receive municipal funding, which gives me an excuse for contact." Helen agreed, feeling a little more hopeful. On the way to the newsroom, she again noticed the dark car following her. This time, she noted the license plate. For the third consecutive night, she received silent calls on her mobile. Someone was trying to intimidate her. The next morning, a blog known for defamation published an article questioning her professional past, insinuating involvement with sources and fabrication of stories. "Don't let it get to you," Dr. Anthony Carter advised when they met for coffee. "This shows you're bothering the right people. Document every intimidation. It might be useful later." With Renee's help, who acted with extreme caution, Helen managed indirect access to Sophie's attendance records. The pattern was clear. Absences of 2 to 3 consecutive days each month, always justified with medical certificates from different professionals. "The absences started approximately a year ago," Renee explained, visibly shaken. "It coincides with the change in her drawings. Look at this one from when she started school." The drawing showed a colorful house with a man in a suit, clearly the father, and a woman in a dress, probably the deceased mother, holding the hand of a smiling little girl, and this one is from 3 months ago. The new drawing showed a large, somber house with a tall, angular female figure in the foreground. There were no faces, only shapes. The small figure representing the child was in a corner, tiny, colorless. Helen felt a tightening in her chest. "Can I have copies?" "Officially, I can't provide them, but if you take quick photos with your phone while I go get coffee." That night, Helen organized all the collected material. She had strong circumstantial evidence, but nothing that constituted irrefutable proof of abuse or neglect. She needed more. She decided to follow a crucial lead: medical records. At the Royal London Hospital, she found Dr. Marina Barrett, a pediatrician who had treated Sophie once. "I cannot break patient confidentiality," the doctor explained, clearly uncomfortable. "But as a health professional, I have an obligation to report suspicions of abuse." "Did you report anything about Sophie Albright?" The doctor hesitated. "I reported inconsistencies between the injuries and the explanations given. The girl had bruises on her back that didn't match the fall in the pool story told by the stepmother. I also noticed signs of extreme anxiety, hypervigilance behavior typical of traumatized children, but I never knew of any follow-up. To whom did you report? Urged Child Protective Services in the area, but shortly after, the family changed pediatricians. I never treated Sophie again. Helen felt a mix of frustration and determination growing within her. The institutional barriers, the power and the influence of the Albrights seemed capable of silencing even medical complaints. But each new piece of information strengthened her conviction that Sophie was in real danger. At Child Protective Services, Helen encountered more resistance. She only managed to confirm that a complaint had been registered, filed after a home visit that found no irregularities. Was it a pre-scheduled visit? Helen asked. Standard procedure, the employee replied, unaware that she had provided crucial information. Of course, a pre-scheduled visit gave Claudia time to prepare everything, rehearse Sophie, create the perfect scenario of a happy family. That night, sitting in her apartment with walls covered in notes, Helen received an unknown text message, "Stop now or your career ends." Instead of feeling fear, Helen felt her determination grow. The next day, she managed to locate a former employee of the New Dawn Foundation, Camilla Roberts, who agreed to meet her at a secluded coffee shop. "Mrs. Albright has an incredible ability to create appearances," Camilla explained, constantly looking around nervously. "At the foundation, we were instructed to prepare everything for sponsor visits. Well-dressed, smiling children, rehearsed testimonies, but the money. Well, let's just say there were many consultancies paid to shell companies." "And what about her relationship with her stepdaughter?" Camilla hesitated. Once Sophie came to the foundation with her father. It was Claudia's birthday, a big event. The girl spilled juice on her new dress. Claudia took her to the bathroom. When they returned, Sophie was pale, trembling. I later found out she was locked in there for hours, being disciplined. Did anyone witness this discipline? Not directly, but I overheard Claudia on the phone once, talking to the family's private pediatrician, Dr. Edward Menzies. She was saying Sophie was inventing pains to get attention, that the doctor shouldn't fall for this childish act. Helen noted the doctor's name. Another lead to follow. The circle was slowly closing around Claudia Vance Albright. But the journalist knew that the decisive element was still missing, the irrefutable proof that could truly protect Sophie. When she left the coffee shop, her phone rang. It was Luke Fisher, the social worker. "I have news," he said, his voice tense. "I got authorization for a visit to the Albright residence. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. So fast?" An anonymous complaint reached the prosecutor's office. "It seems we're not the only ones concerned about little Sophie." Helen hung up, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. The visit would be the first official step to protect Sophie, but it could also be easily manipulated by Claudia's cunning. Looking at the photo of the girl at the mall, trying to pull off those tight red shoes, Helen made a silent promise. She wouldn't rest until Sophie could walk free from pain, both physical and emotional. The battle was just beginning, and it would be fought not only against Claudia, but against an entire system that often turned a blind eye to suffering hidden behind the perfect facades of London's high society. The morning of the home visit dawned with a cloudy sky over London. Helen wouldn't be able to accompany Luke on the official visit, but she had arranged to meet him afterward to learn the results. Nevertheless, she drove to the elegant Kensington estate where the Albrights lived. From a distance, she observed the social worker's arrival. As expected, the official social services car was cordially received by the estate's security guard. Helen imagined the scene inside the mansion, everything perfectly arranged, Sophie in her best dress, Claudia with her rehearsed smile. 3 hours later, Luke emerged. From his grim expression, Helen already knew the outcome. "Dollhouse," he said when they met at a nearby bakery. "Princess room, expensive toys, family photos everywhere." The girl was clean, well-dressed, seemingly healthy. No visible signs of abuse or neglect. Did she say anything? Almost nothing. She answered questions in monosyllables, always looking at her stepmother first. Claudia never left us alone with Sophie. It's standard procedure to interview the child separately, but she insisted the girl got anxious with strangers, and her husband supported it. Was Richard there? He arrived halfway through the visit. He seemed uncomfortable. I can't explain it. like he was playing a role that didn't fit him well. Helen sighed, frustrated but not surprised. What happens now? Officially, we have no reason to proceed, but... Luke lowered his voice. I requested an independent psychological evaluation. It's standard procedure in suspicious cases. I managed to schedule it for next week at the reference center. Will they show up? They'll have to. The request has the backing of the prosecutor's office. If they don't, it will raise more suspicions. It was a small victory. Helen thanked him and said goodbye, feeling a little more hopeful. Returning to the newsroom, she found Deborah waiting at her desk. I have something you need to see, her colleague whispered, discreetly handing her a USB drive. I got access to the New Dawn Foundation's financial reports for the last 3 years. Those consultancies I mentioned, they're all for companies registered in Claudia's brother's name. We're talking about millions embezzled. Helen connected the USB drive and quickly examined the documents. It was an elaborate money laundering scheme. Under normal circumstances, it would be the headline of the month. But her focus remained on Sophie. I'll save this for later, she said, copying the files to her personal computer. It might be useful as leverage if necessary. That afternoon, she received an unexpected call. A male voice, tense and whispered, Mrs. Sawyer, I'm Jake Parsons, the Albright family driver. We need to talk. They arranged a discreet meeting at a motorway service station on the M25 motorway. Jake seemed nervous, constantly looking around. I know you're investigating Mrs. Claudia. Her security guards are tracking your calls, following your movements. How do you know that? I hear things. In the car they talk like I don't exist. I'm just the driver, invisible. He paused, taking a deep breath. I have a daughter Sophie's age. I can't stay silent anymore. Helen felt her heart quicken. This was the witness she needed, someone from the inner circle. What did you see, Jake? Mrs. Claudia. She has 2 faces. In front of others, she's all smiles and affection. When they're alone in the back seat, it's another story. She pinches the girl where no one sees, twists her little arm, whispers terrible things. You useless child, you ungrateful. You ruined my life. And what about the tight shoes? Have you seen anything like that? Jake nodded affirmatively. It wasn't the first time. She buys clothes and shoes smaller on purpose. Says it's for Sophie to learn to have a proper young lady's posture. Once the girl's toes were purple when she took off her shoes in the car. And the father? Does he know? Mr. Richard travels a lot. When he's home, Mrs. Claudia is a different person, but he chooses not to see. There was a time Sophie tried to talk about the punishments, and he said it was childish exaggeration, that she needed to give her new mother a chance. Helen felt anger rising within her. The father was complicit by omission. Would you testify officially, Jake? The man hesitated, fear visible in his eyes. I have a family, Mrs. Sawyer. I need my job, but... He took a deep breath. If it's to help Sophie, yes. I'll do whatever it takes. It was the turning point Helen had been waiting for. An eyewitness, someone from the inner circle willing to speak. They arranged for Jake to gather more evidence, while Helen prepared the ground for a formal complaint. The next day, Helen received an anonymous email. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was a montage of photos of her, following the Albrights talking to Renee, Luke, and Jake. The message was clear. We know what you're doing. This is your last warning. Instead of backing down, Helen printed the email and added it to the growing dossier. If they were trying to intimidate her so strongly, it was because they had a lot to hide. That same afternoon, she received a call from Renee. I need to see you urgently, the coordinator said, her voice choked. It's about Sophie. They met in a park far from the school. Renee looked like she had been crying. Sophie didn't come to school today. I received a strange call from Claudia's secretary, cancelling the psychological evaluation scheduled by Child Protective Services. They claimed they're traveling for 2 weeks for the treatment of a respiratory condition the girl has. They're fleeing the evaluation, Helen concluded, feeling panic rise. We need to act now. Helen called Luke, who confirmed he had received the same notification. Legally, they can postpone, as long as they present medical reports. And guess what? I've already received a fax from Dr. Edward Menzies, attesting to the urgent need to take Sophie for treatment in a milder climate. The family doctor, The one Claudia manipulates, Helen murmured, remembering the information provided by Camilla. We need to stop them. Without a court order, we can't. And to get an order, we need more compelling evidence than we have now. Helen hung up, feeling cornered. The Albrights were using their power and influence to isolate Sophie even further, possibly to prevent her from speaking with independent professionals. She decided to risk everything. She gathered all the material collected so far, the images from the mall and the school, the testimonies, the inconsistent medical records, the school absences, the drawings, the evidence of embezzlement at the foundation. She added a detailed statement of her personal observations and sent everything to Dr. Beatrice Miller, a prosecutor for children and youth known for her firm stance against child abuse. It's not ideal, Dr. Anthony admitted when Helen consulted him. We'd prefer more direct evidence, but if they're planning to remove the girl to avoid investigation, we can argue urgency. For the first time in weeks, Helen felt that perhaps she hadn't done enough, fast enough. If Sophie was taken away, retrieving her would be much harder. Guilt consumed her from within. It was then her mobile rang. It was Jake again. I'm leaving work now. I'm not going back. I have something you need to see. They met at a hotel on Oxford Street, where Jake had checked in with his family. I installed a recorder in the car, he explained, trembling slightly. I know it's illegal, but I couldn't bear to see that child suffer anymore without being able to do anything. He handed a small recording device to Helen. It's all there. Conversations from the last 3 days, including about the travel plans. It's not medical treatment. They're taking her to their beach house in the Hamptons, where she'll be isolated until, in Mrs. Claudia's words, that meddling journalist stops sticking her nose where it's not wanted. Helen connected the device to her laptop. Claudia's cold voice filled the room. Sophie, you will tell the doctor exactly what I taught you. That you have difficulty breathing, that your throat hurts. Understood. If you don't do it right, you know what happens. Those red shoes will seem like a dream compared to what awaits you. In another recording, Claudia spoke to Richard. You need to support this respiratory treatment story. That journalist is asking questions, that social worker too. If they investigate too much, they might discover things that would harm both of us, Richard. Remember the construction company's contracts with the city council? The money in the Cayman Islands? Everything could come out. The most disturbing was a conversation with Sophie alone when she believed they were alone in the car. Do you know why I use these methods, Sophie? Because I learned that discipline leaves no marks. Your mother spoiled you too much. Look at the result, a weak, whiny girl. The shoes are for you to learn to endure pain without complaining. The hunger is for you to value what you have. I'm preparing you for the real world, which isn't this fairy tale your father allows you to believe. Helen, Jake, and Dr. Anthony listened in horrified silence. When they finished, there was no doubt Sophie was in imminent danger, and the recordings, though possibly inadmissible in court as they were obtained without authorization, made clear the need for immediate intervention. I'm taking this to Dr. Beatrice right now, Helen decided. And you, Jake, need to file a police report. Your life could be at risk when they find out. The driver nodded, resigned. I've already lost my job anyway. And I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do something to help that girl. While driving to the prosecutor's office, Helen received a call from Renee. I just found out. The Albrights are leaving tomorrow morning for the Hamptons, a private jet at London City Airport. They've already arranged Sophie's school transfer. It was the final confirmation. Time was running out. Sophie would be taken away in less than 24 hours, and the entire protection network built until then would become useless. That night, Helen didn't sleep. She worked tirelessly, organizing all the evidence, preparing a complete dossier. At 6 in the morning, she was at Dr. Beatrice Miller's office door, waiting for her arrival. When the prosecutor heard the recordings, her face hardened. I will request an emergency protection order right now, and a warrant to prevent the child from being removed from the city. If we get it in time, Sophie won't board that plane. Helen watched the prosecutor urgently drafting the documents, sending them to the duty judge. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, mixed with fear and hope. The race against time had begun, and Sophie's future depended on the outcome. Dr. Beatrice Miller's office was buzzing with activity that morning. The prosecutor for children and youth, A 50-year-old woman with a firm demeanor and determined gaze mobilized her team in record time. Judge Mark Taylor is reviewing the request now, she informed Helen, who was anxiously waiting. We have a good chance. He's known for prioritizing the child's well-being, above all other interests. Helen checked her watch, 8:15 a.m. The Albrights' private flight was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. The window of time was too narrow. What if the judge denies the request? Then we appeal to higher instances. But I won't lie, it would be much harder to retrieve Sophie once she leaves the city. At that moment, the phone rang. It was the judge's chambers. Decision granted, Beatrice announced after hanging up, a smile of relief on her face. We have the emergency protection order and the injunction to prevent the child's removal from the jurisdiction. Helen felt her legs weaken with relief. And now the hard part. Bailiffs and Child Protective Services counselors are on their way to the airport and the Albright residence. We don't know exactly where the child is at this moment. Luke Fisher, the social worker, rushed into the room. I just received information from Child Protective Services. The team arrived at the Albright mansion. The house is empty, except for some staff. The family has already left. To the airport, Helen concluded, feeling her heart race. We need to inform the team heading there. They've already been informed, Beatrice confirmed, grabbing her bag. And we're going too. I want to be present when we locate Sophie. London traffic, as always, was chaotic. Helen, Luke, and Beatrice were in an official prosecutor's office car, trying to make their way through the vehicles. I called airport administration, Beatrice informed, hanging up the phone. The private jet is on the runway but hasn't taken off yet. I asked them to hold the aircraft until our arrival. When they finally arrived at London City Airport, they were greeted by the head of security, who quickly guided them through the VIP terminal. The aircraft is held, but we had a problem. The Albrights claimed there's no child on board. Only Mr. Richard and Mrs. Claudia boarded. They hid her, Helen concluded, feeling panic rise. Or sent her by other means. Or through another airport, Luke added. Heathrow, perhaps. Or even by land. The head of security led them to the private boarding area. The private jet pilot waited beside the aircraft, visibly irritated by the delay. Inside the cabin, they could see the silhouettes of Richard and Claudia gesturing, apparently arguing. I have a court order, Beatrice announced, presenting the document to the pilot. We need to verify if there's a minor on board. As I've already told security, only Mr. and Mrs. Albright boarded. There is no child. Even so, we need to verify. As they approached the boarding stairs, the aircraft door opened. Richard Albright appeared, his expression tense. What is the meaning of this? We're late for an important engagement. Mr. Albright, we have a court order to locate your daughter Sophie, Beatrice explained, extending the document. There's a protection order in effect. Richard's face visibly paled. This is absurd. My daughter is safe. We have the right to travel to our beach house whenever we want. Not without an explanation for the evidence of abuse and neglect we've gathered, the prosecutor countered, unyielding. Where is Sophie? Before Richard could answer, Claudia appeared behind him, her face a mask of controlled indignation. What ridiculous accusations are these? I'm president of 3 children's foundations. I dedicate my life to the well-being of underprivileged children. And now I'm accused of mistreating my own stepdaughter? Mrs. Albright, cooperate by informing us of Sophie's whereabouts and everything will be resolved as discreetly as possible, Beatrice offered. Helen watched the scene, noticing how Claudia maintained her composure, while Richard seemed increasingly nervous. Suddenly she had an intuition. She's not with them, she whispered to Luke, and Richard doesn't know where Sophie is right now. While the discussion continued on the tarmac, Helen discreetly moved away and called Renee. I need you to urgently check if Sophie was dropped off at school today. 5 minutes later, Renee returned the call. No, she didn't come. But I received a strange call from Claudia's private secretary. She wanted to confirm if the transfer documents were ready to be picked up today. She mentioned that a certain Vivian would come to get them. Vivian? Who is Vivian? I don't know. Never heard of her. Helen hung up and returned to the group. The discussion continued, with Claudia now accusing the prosecution of persecution. Dr. Miller, Helen interrupted. We need to check who Vivian is. possibly an employee or trusted person of the Albrights. She might be with Sophie right now. The prosecutor nodded and, while the bailiff searched the aircraft, confirming the child's absence, made some calls. Vivian Rhodes, she informed after hanging up. Claudia's personal secretary for 5 years. We just confirmed that she picked Sophie up from the house this morning, supposedly to take her to the doctor. Richard Albright looked surprised at his wife. What are you talking about? You told me Sophie was already in the Hamptons with the housekeeper. Claudia's face hardened for an instant before regaining her controlled expression. It's a misunderstanding, dear. Vivian was taking Sophie to Dr. Edwards' office before heading to Heathrow Airport. From there they would go directly to the Hamptons, without informing me of this change of plans. And it was a last-minute decision. I didn't want to worry you with details. Helen and Beatrice exchanged glances. The story didn't hold up. More importantly, it had created a visible fissure between the couple. Mr. Albright, Beatrice intervened, seizing the moment. The situation is serious. We have substantial evidence that your daughter is suffering psychological abuse and neglect. If you cooperate now by immediately locating Sophie, it will be considered in your favor. The businessman seemed genuinely confused and worried. Finally, he took out his mobile and called. Vivian, where are you with Sophie? He listened for a few seconds, his face changing expression. What do you mean, following the plan? What plan? A few more seconds. No, bring my daughter back right now. I'm at the airport with the authorities. When he hung up, he looked pale. She's at Dr. Edward Menzies' office, Don Park Lane. Vivian took her for a supposed checkup before the trip. And why didn't you know about this? Helen questioned, fixing him with an accusatory gaze. I trusted Claudia's arrangements. She handles those details. Details? We're talking about your daughter. The team mobilized quickly. While Beatrice, Luke, and the bailiffs headed to the doctor's office, Helen remained at the airport with Richard and Claudia, who were prevented from boarding. This is absurd, Claudia repeated, but her tone no longer had the same conviction. You're ruining our reputation for nothing. If there's nothing to hide, why such a rush to take Sophie out of the city precisely when an independent psychological evaluation was scheduled? Helen questioned, standing firm. Coincidence. The trip was planned weeks ago. Lie, Richard interjected surprisingly. You suggested this trip the day before yesterday, after I mentioned the social worker's call. It was the first time Helen saw a real fracture in the Albrights' marriage. Richard was starting to question his wife's actions, and that could make all the difference for Sophie. 30 minutes later, Helen's phone rang. Hi, it was Beatrice. We located Sophie. She was at the doctor's office, being prepared for a hypnotherapy session that would make her drowsy for the trip. The doctor is already detained for falsifying medical reports. Vivian, too. The girl is scared but physically well. And now we follow protocol. Sophie will be taken for a forensic medical examination, then for an emergency psychological evaluation. Considering the circumstances, I will request temporary placement in a specialized institution until the investigations are concluded. Helen hung up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. Sophie was safe, at least for now, but the path to complete justice would still be long. They found your daughter, she announced to Richard. She was being sedated to facilitate transport. Sedated? The man paled even further. Without my authorization? This cannot be true. Ask your wife, Helen suggested, observing Claudia, who kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mask of perfection finally beginning to crumble. At that moment, as she watched the couple who now barely looked at each other, Helen understood that the truth was finally beginning to emerge. The empire of lies built by Claudia was collapsing, and Richard Albright would have to decide which side he would take, that of his manipulative wife or his vulnerable daughter. 2 hours later, Helen waited in the waiting room of the medical examiner's office. Sophie was undergoing examinations, accompanied by a psychologist specializing in child trauma and child protective services. Beatrice entered, looking exhausted but determined. The initial results are concerning, she informed. There are no signs of severe recent physical abuse, but old bruises in different stages of healing were found. Most alarming is her psychological state. Sophie barely speaks, shows clear signs of extreme anxiety and fear of doing something wrong. What happens now? The judge ordered provisional institutional care, in a specialized home for vulnerable children. It's a good place with trained professionals. Sophie will stay there while the process runs. Richard can visit her under supervision. And Claudia? She is prohibited from any contact. Furthermore, the judge issued search and seizure warrants for the residence and for the foundation offices. Helen nodded, feeling that justice was finally beginning to work. At that moment, she saw Sophie leaving the examination room accompanied by the psychologist. The girl looked small and fragile, her frightened eyes scanning the environment. When she saw Helen, something in her gaze changed, a brief flash of recognition. Helen smiled gently at her, feeling a lump in her throat. This was just the beginning of a long recovery process for Sophie. But for the first time there was hope. The silence imposed by the tight shoes was beginning to break, giving way to the possibility of her own voice, of steps free from pain, of a childhood rescued from the shadows of fear. The days following Sophie's removal from the Albrights' custody were intense. The news quickly leaked to the press, generating sensational headlines. Philanthropist accused of mistreating stepdaughter. Empire of appearances, the hidden face of Claudia Vance. Heiress suffered in silence while stepmother posed as benefactor. Helen kept her distance from the media coverage. Her focus now was to follow the legal process and ensure Sophie received all necessary support. As a journalist, she knew she could turn the case into a major report, but as a human being, she chose to respect the time and privacy the girl needed. "How is she?" she asked Luke when they met at the coffee shop near the courthouse. "Adjusting," the social worker replied. "The new Dawn shelter is one of the best places we have. Multidisciplinary team, welcoming environment. Sophie is receiving daily psychological support." "Does she talk about what happened?" "Gradually. Dr. Marianne, a psychologist specializing in child trauma, is conducting play therapy sessions. Sophie still has difficulty verbalizing the experiences, but expresses herself through drawings." Luke discreetly showed some photos on his phone, drawings made by Sophie in recent days. The first ones were somber, dark figures, a tiny girl in a corner. But the most recent one showed a small sun rising in a corner of the page. "It's a start," he commented, putting away his phone. "But the road will be long." That afternoon, Helen attended the first preliminary hearing of the case at the courthouse. In the waiting room, she spotted Richard Albright sitting alone, appearing to have aged years in a few days. Beside him, not his wife, but a nationally renowned lawyer. "Mr. Albright," Helen approached, sitting nearby. "How are you?" Richard looked up, surprisingly without hostility. "Destroyed," he admitted in a low voice. "How didn't I notice? How did I allow this to happen under my own roof?" It was a rhetorical question, but Helen answered anyway. "Because it was convenient not to see. Because Claudia took care of everything related to Sophie, while you dedicated yourself to business. Because it was easier to believe in the perfection she presented than to question what was happening behind the scenes." He didn't retort, just nodded slowly. "I filed for divorce," he revealed after a few moments of silence. "And I'm cooperating fully with the investigations. I want my daughter back, Miss Sawyer. I'll do whatever it takes to get her back and atone for my mistakes." Before Helen could answer, the door to the hearing room opened. From the opposite side of the corridor, Claudia arrived escorted by a team of 3 lawyers and a press advisor. She was impeccably dressed and made up, as if prepared for a photo shoot. Seeing Richard talking to Helen, her eyes flashed with momentary hatred before regaining her serene expression. "The show has begun," Richard murmured, standing up. "She was always an excellent actress. I just didn't imagine I'd be part of the audience, not the cast." The hearing was closed, so Helen waited in the corridor. 2 hours later, Beatrice emerged from the room with a victorious expression. The judge maintained Sophie's institutional placement and ordered a complete psychosocial evaluation of all involved, she informed. "Richard will have the right to supervised visits twice a week. Claudia remains prohibited from any contact. And the driver's recordings?" The judge accepted them as evidence to justify the protective measures, but warned that they might be challenged as proof in the main process because they were obtained without legal authorization. "We need to strengthen the case with other evidence." In the following days, the case gained even more visibility when journalists began investigating the foundations presided over by Claudia. Allegations of embezzlement, overpriced contracts, and even falsification of results to attract donors emerged. Claudia counterattacked with an aggressive public relations strategy. She gave emotional interviews, presenting herself as a victim of a conspiracy. She hired a crisis management agency that launched the Truth for Claudia campaign, flooding social media with testimonials from people benefited by her foundations. "Classic misdirection," Anthony Carter commented when he met with Helen and Beatrice. "She wants to turn this into a trial about her philanthropic work, not about her behavior as a stepmother." "Is it working?" Helen asked, concerned. "Parallelly," Beatrice admitted. "Public opinion is divided. Many question why a woman who helped so many underprivileged children would mistreat her own stepdaughter." "Because they are different worlds," Helen replied. "Philanthropy was her stage, her social theatre. Sophie was a private obstacle, a constant reminder that she would never be the only woman in Richard's life, that there was a bond she couldn't break." The prosecutor nodded. "Thoughtful. We need something more compelling," she concluded. "Something that Sophie herself can tell us when she's ready." 2 days later, Helen received an unexpected call from Marianne, the psychologist attending Sophie at the shelter. "Sophie asked about you," the professional said. "She recognized you from a report she saw on TV, said you were at the mall that day, that you saw her trying to take off her shoes." Helen felt her heart tighten. "Does she want to see me?" "I believe so. It would be beneficial for the therapeutic process. She's starting to recognize allies, people she can trust. It's an important step." With due judicial authorization, Helen visited the shelter the next day. The place was welcoming, decorated with vibrant colors and children's drawings. In the garden, several children played under the supervision of educators. Sophie was sitting alone on a bench, observing the other children without participating. Under the psychologist's guidance, Helen approached slowly. "Hello, Sophie. Do you remember me? I'm Helen." The girl looked up, nodding shyly. "You were at the mall," she said in a low voice. "You saw my red shoes." "Yes, I did. They seemed to be hurting a lot." Sophie was silent for a few moments, then whispered, "She always bought them small. Said it was for me to learn posture, that elegant girls know how to endure discomfort." Helen sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "That wasn't right, Sophie. No one should make you go through discomfort on purpose." The girl played with the hem of her dress, avoiding eye contact. "Can I tell you a secret?" she finally asked. "Of course. I'm afraid my daddy won't want me back. Aunt Claudia always said he only tolerated me out of obligation, that I was a burden, a reminder of my mom he wanted to forget." Helen felt a lump in her throat. "Your father is very worried about you, Sophie. He's been coming to visit you, hasn't he?" "Yes, but what if it's just pretend? So people won't speak ill of him. I think he's truly sorry for not realizing what was happening. Sometimes adults make big mistakes by not paying attention." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Sophie revealing small fragments of her life with her stepmother, punishments without food, tight clothes, constant humiliations, always when her father wasn't around. "She had a game," Sophie recounted. "Called it Perfect Statue. I had to stand still without moving for a long time. If I moved, I got a bad point. When I reached 10 bad points, the punishment came." "What kind of punishment?" "Fjärrstokivsten, staying in the darkroom, or wearing tight shoes for a whole day, or going without dinner." Each revelation was like a stab to Helen's heart. How had a 7-year-old endured all that alone? Before saying goodbye, Sophie made an unexpected request. "Can you bring paper and colored pencils next time? I want to draw you a picture." "Of course. Do you like to draw?" "I used to. With Mom. Then I stopped because Aunt Claudia said my drawings were ugly. But Dr. Marianne says they're pretty." "I'm sure they're beautiful. I'd love to have one." Leaving the shelter, Helen met Beatrice, who was waiting for her. "How was it?" "Revealing," Helen replied, still emotional. "Sophie is starting to talk. It's not just the tight shoes. There was an elaborate system of psychological control and punishments. We need to formally record all of this." The prosecutor nodded. "Marianne is documenting all sessions. When Sophie is ready, we'll conduct a special hearing with all safeguards to avoid re-victimization." As they talked, Helen's mobile rang. It was Jake, the former driver. "Mrs. Sawyer, I have more information. Mrs. Claudia called me." Offered me money to change my testimony, to say I made the recordings out of revenge after being fired. How much? £200,000. She said it was my word against hers, and that she had far more resources to defend herself. And what did you say? That I wasn't for sale. But I pretended to consider it to buy time. I scheduled a meeting for tomorrow to discuss details. Helen and Beatrice exchanged glances. That's attempted obstruction of justice, the prosecutor stated. We can set up an operation to legally record that conversation. Everything was organized for the next day. Jake was equipped with a judicially authorized recorder and instructed on how to conduct the conversation. Prosecutor's office agents positioned themselves discreetly at the meeting location, a coffee shop in Westfield, Stratford City. Claudia arrived punctually, accompanied only by her private driver, who remained at a distance. She was more discreet than usual, wearing sunglasses and a scarf on her head. I thought you had more loyalty, Jake, she began as soon as she sat down. After 5 years working for our family, loyalty has limits, Mrs. Claudia. What I saw happen to the girl... Exaggerations. Sophie was always a difficult, manipulative child. She invented stories to get her father's attention. I was just trying to set boundaries to educate her properly. Boundaries? Do you call leaving the girl without food boundaries, or forcing her to wear shoes that hurt? Claudia smiled coldly. A matter of interpretation. But we're not here to debate educational methods. I brought the documentation for our transaction. She slid an envelope across the table. Consultancy contract. 200,000 as agreed. Half now, half when you retract your testimony, stating that the recordings were manipulated. And if I don't accept? Claudia's smile disappeared. That would be very disappointing. I have connections, Jake. I can ensure you never work in this city again. Besides, who would believe you against me? The word of a fired driver against a respected philanthropist? I have the recordings. Recordings obtained illegally, which any competent judge will discard. I'm offering a dignified way out. Enough money to start over somewhere else, away from this mess. Jake hesitated, playing his role well. And what exactly should I say about the recordings? That you edited them out of revenge after being fired. That I never mistreated Sophie. I merely set rules that you, as an employee, had no right to question. At that moment, the prosecutor's office agents approached the table. Claudia Vance Albright, you are under arrest for attempted obstruction of justice and witness tampering. The shock on Claudia's face was momentary. In seconds, she composed herself and assumed an expression of indignation. This is absurd, a trap. My lawyers will... But the words died in her throat when she noticed the discreet cameras that had recorded the entire conversation. This time there was no stage, no admiring audience, only the raw reality of her own words and actions. As Claudia was discreetly escorted out of the mall, Helen watched from a distance. The mask had finally fallen completely, and with this new evidence legally obtained, the case against Claudia significantly strengthened. That night, Helen received a call from Beatrice. The judge ordered Claudia's preventive detention for obstruction of justice. Furthermore, based on Sophie's new testimonies to the psychologist, he scheduled a special hearing for next week. Sophie will have to testify, not directly in a conventional hearing. It will be a special interview, in a protected environment, only with the psychologist and the judge. The procedure is recorded and presented later, and Richard continues to cooperate. He formally requested the resumption of custody with psychosocial support. The judge will still decide. Helen hung up, feeling that justice was finally moving in the right direction. Sophie's case was far from over, but for the first time since that afternoon at the mall, there was real hope that the little girl with the red shoes could regain not only her safety, but also her voice and her childhood. The special testimony room at the courthouse had been carefully prepared to receive Sophie. Unlike the austere hearing rooms, this environment had soft colors, comfortable armchairs, and some carefully selected toys. The objective was to minimize the trauma of the interview, allowing the child to feel safe sharing her experiences. Helena awaited in the corridor along with Beatrice. By court order, only the psychologist Marianne would be present with Sophie during the testimony. The judge, prosecutors, and lawyers would follow through closed-circuit TV in an adjacent room. Is she ready for this? Helen asked, concerned. Dr. Marianne believes so, Beatrice replied. In the last 2 weeks, Sophie has made significant progress in therapy. She's more communicative, less fearful. The important thing is that she understands she's helping herself and potentially other children. Richard Albright arrived, accompanied by his lawyer, Mr. Morris. He seemed nervous but determined. He greeted Helen with a discreet nod. "How is she today?" he asked the prosecutor, calm considering the circumstances. "She spent the morning with Dr. Marianne preparing." Richard nodded, running a hand through his hair, now visibly grey at the temples. "I still can't believe I allowed this to happen," he murmured, more to himself than to others. "I was so absorbed in business, so convinced that Claudia was the perfect stepmother." "Now is the time to look forward," his lawyer, Mr. Morris, intervened. "We are demonstrating your full cooperation and sincere desire to regain custody under the necessary conditions." Minutes later, Claudia's defense team arrived, led by renowned criminal lawyer Mr. Paul Morton. Claudia, who had obtained provisional release after posting bail for the attempted bribery, entered last. She was more subdued in her appearance, as if trying to look more maternal and less like a socialite. She deliberately ignored Helen and Richard's presence, heading straight for the observation room. Judge Mark Taylor, a middle-aged man with a serene expression and attentive gaze, gathered everyone before the start of the interview. "I want to make it clear that this is not a conventional hearing. Sophie's well-being is our absolute priority. Dr. Marianne will conduct the conversation in a manner appropriate to the child's psychological development, without inducements or pressures. All present must maintain absolute silence during the broadcast." Everyone nodded and took their places in front of the monitors. Helen sat at the back of the room, as an observer authorized by the judge, due to her status as a key witness and a person of reference for Sophie. Moments later, the broadcast began. Sophie entered the special room holding Marianne's hand. She wore a simple, comfortable dress, unlike the formal and restrictive clothes Claudia forced her to wear. Her brown hair was tied in a loose braid, and she carried a small backpack. "It's all right, Sophie," Marianne said sweetly, sitting in one of the armchairs. "Remember what we talked about? You just need to tell your story in your own way." Sophie nodded, sitting shyly. "Can I draw while I talk?" "Sometimes it's easier." "Of course you can. Did you bring your pencils and paper?" The girl opened her backpack, taking out a colorful pencil case and some sheets of paper. Helen recognized the material she had brought for her on her last visit to the shelter. For almost 2 hours, Sophie spoke. At first with hesitation, then with more fluidity as she felt comfortable. While drawing, she recounted episodes of her life with Claudia, the bad point system that resulted in punishments, the deliberately tight shoes, the itchy clothes, the long periods without food as punishment for inappropriate behavior. "Once I spilled juice on the living room carpet," Sophie recounted, drawing a large red stain on one of her sheets. "Aunt Claudia got very angry. She made me kneel beside the stain for hours, until my knees were red and sore. Then I had to clean it with a small brush, even after the maid had already cleaned it with the machine." Mariana conducted the conversation with professionalism, without inducing answers, just helping Sophie elaborate on her experiences. "And how did you feel when these things happened?" Sophie stopped drawing for a moment, thoughtful, alone scared. "I thought there was something wrong with me, that I deserved the punishments for not being good enough. Aunt Claudia said if I told my daddy, he would be disappointed and send me to a boarding school far away." In the observation room, everyone watched in silence. Helen noticed Richard's trembling hands, his face contorted in an expression of pain as he listened to his daughter's accounts. On the other side of the room, Claudia remained impassive, occasionally whispering with her lawyers. Sophie continued her narrative, now addressing recent events. "The day they tried to take me to the Hamptons, Aunt Claudia said I should pretend to be sick, that I should cough and say my throat hurt a lot. Dr. Edward was going to give me medicine to make me sleep during the trip." "Did you know why they were doing that?" "Aunt Claudia said bad people wanted to separate us, that they wanted to destroy our family, that it was all the fault of that nosy journalist." Helen felt a tightening in her chest, hearing how she had been portrayed to the child. "And what did you think about that?" Sophie was silent for a moment, scribbling distractedly on the paper. I didn't think the journalist was bad. She saw me at the mall. She was the only person who stopped when I was crying because of the shoes. Everyone else looked and passed by. She looked into my eyes. The simple yet profound statement made Helen swallow hard to contain her emotion. At the end of the interview, Marianne asked Sophie to show her drawings and explain each one. There were representations of punishments, tight clothes, long periods alone in her room. But there was also a different drawing, a figure representing Sophie, herself, holding hands with her father and a woman she identified as Mrs. Zelda, the former housekeeper who had been kind to her. Above a large yellow sun. "This is how I want it to be from now on," Sophie explained, "with people who don't hurt me." When the interview ended, there were no dry eyes in the observation room except for Claudia's, who maintained her controlled expression, though visibly tense. The judge ordered a 30-minute break before proceeding with the parties' considerations. In the corridor, Helen found Richard, who looked devastated. "I completely failed her," he said, his voice choked. "How does a father not notice his own daughter's suffering?" "You have the chance to correct that now," Helen replied. "Sophie still loves you, still wants her father in her life, but she needs a present, attentive father who truly protects her." Richard nodded, discreetly wiping his eyes. "I will go through any therapy, any evaluation the court determines. I will completely reorganize my life. Work will never again be a priority over her." When everyone returned to the main hearing room, the atmosphere was solemn. Sophie's testimony had deeply impacted everyone, making it impossible to ignore the reality of the abuse she had suffered. "Before we proceed," the judge announced, "I have been informed that there is additional evidence the prosecutor's office wishes to present." Beatrice stood up. "Your Honor, a few days ago, we received an additional recording made by Mr. Jake Parsons, the family driver. Unlike the previous recordings, this one was made after judicial authorization, during a trip by Claudia Albright with Sophie, approximately a month before the events that culminated in this process. Claudia's lawyer immediately protested, claiming the defense had not been notified about this new evidence. After a brief discussion, the judge allowed the recording to be played, but guaranteed the defense ample right to contest it later. The room fell silent as Claudia's cold voice filled the environment. "These shoes are your size, Sophie. Stop the drama. Do you know there are orphaned children who don't even have food to eat? You have everything, and you still complain. Honestly, sometimes I think your mother spoiled you too much." Sophie's childish voice was almost inaudible, but it hurts, Aunt Claudia. "It's tight. Life hurts, dear. Better learn that early. Besides, tight shoes develop discipline and posture. At your age, I wore even smaller shoes, because my mother knew the importance of raising an elegant woman." There was a pause, and then Claudia's voice returned, lower, more threatening. "If you complain to your father, you know what will happen, don't you? He'll realize you're a spoiled, ungrateful girl, and he'll send you to a boarding school. Is that what you want? To be away from him? No, Aunt Claudia. Then behave. Wear the shoes without complaining. Smile when people look. And remember, our secrets stay between us." The recording ended, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Richard had his face buried in his hands. Claudia's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Claudia herself kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her mask of serenity finally beginning to crack. "The recording speaks for itself," Beatrice declared. "It clearly demonstrates the pattern of psychological abuse, manipulation, veiled threats, the deliberate use of physical discomfort as a method of control." The judge nodded gravely. "Does the defense wish to make a statement?" Mr. Paul Morton stood up, visibly trying to reorganize his strategy. "Your Honor, even if we accept the authenticity of this recording, which still needs to be technically verified, we have here a matter of interpretation regarding educational methods. Mrs. Albright may have been strict, perhaps excessively traditionalist in her approach, but this does not constitute abuse under the law." "Traditionalist?" The judge interrupted with a rare display of emotion. Deliberately causing physical pain to a child and then threatening her to keep silent goes far beyond traditionalism. "Counselor." The defense continued to argue, presenting diplomas and certificates from Claudia's foundations, testimonies from children benefiting from her social projects, letters of support from celebrities and politicians. But the atmosphere in the room had definitively changed. Not all the philanthropy in the world could erase what everyone had witnessed, the real suffering of a child, under the care of someone who should protect her. At the end of the considerations, the judge announced that he would need a few days to issue his final decision on Sophie's permanent custody and possible criminal developments against Claudia. However, he ordered the maintenance of the protective measures and authorized the expansion of Richard's visits to his daughter, still under supervision. When the session ended, Claudia left escorted by her lawyers, ignoring the reporters who awaited in the lobby. Her public image, carefully constructed over years, was crumbling with each new detail revealed. Helen observed the scene with a mix of relief and concern. The legal battle was underway, but Sophie's emotional battle was just beginning. How would such a young child process all this? How would she rebuild trust in the adult world after such betrayal? That night, Helen received special authorization to visit Sophie at the shelter. She found the girl in the garden, drawing under the soft light of dusk. "Hi, Sophie," she greeted, sitting beside her. "What are you drawing?" "A new house," the girl replied without looking up from the paper. "For me to live with my daddy. It has a big room with windows and a garden with a swing." "That's a beautiful drawing." Sophie finally looked at her. "Was I brave today?" "You were very brave. Braver than many adults I know." The girl smiled shyly, the first true smile Helen had seen on her face. "I was scared. But Dr. Marianne said telling the truth would help me not have nightmares anymore." "And have you been having many nightmares?" "Before I had them every night. Now just sometimes. I dream I'm trapped in a giant shoe that's going to swallow me." Helen felt her heart ache. Those nightmares will lessen over time. "You're safe now." Sophie nodded, returning to her drawing. She added a small figure next to the house. "That's you," she explained. "Visiting. You can come for tea when I'm in my new house." "It would be a pleasure," Helen replied, touched by the simple but deeply meaningful invitation. As she watched Sophie draw, Helen reflected on how a child, even after suffering deep trauma, still maintained the capacity to imagine a better future, to believe there would be a new house, a fresh start. It was a lesson in resilience that many adults would never learn. Before saying goodbye, Sophie handed Helen the finished drawing. "So you don't forget the tea promise," she said with childish seriousness. "I'll never forget," Helen assured her, carefully putting away the paper. "It's a promise." Leaving the shelter, Helen looked up at London's starry sky, rarely visible through the metropolis's pollution. That night, however, the stars seemed exceptionally bright, like small points of hope in the darkness, reflecting the light that was beginning to rekindle in Sophie's eyes. 6 months passed since the hearing that forever changed Sophie Albright's life. Spring arrived in London, bringing with it renewal and hope, not only in nature, but also for the little girl who had faced so much in her few years of life. Helen parked her car in front of a simple yet cozy townhouse in the Chelsea neighborhood. It was very different from the sumptuous mansion where Sophie had lived with her father and Claudia. The front garden, small but well kept, had colorful flowers and a swing hanging from a leafy tree, exactly as in the drawing Sophie had made months earlier. This was Richard and Sophie Albright's new home. After the divorce, Richard had sold the mansion and several other properties, opting for a simpler, more present life. The court decision had been clear. He could retain custody of his daughter, provided he met a series of conditions, including family therapy, active participation in Sophie's school life, and reorganization of his professional life to prioritize fatherhood. Surprising many, Richard not only accepted the conditions, but embraced them completely. He sold a majority stake in his companies, keeping only projects that allowed flexible hours. He enrolled in a conscious parenting course and didn't miss a single therapy session. Helen rang the doorbell, adjusting the package she carried. She was greeted by Mrs. Zelda, the former housekeeper whom Richard had rehired, now as house manager and a supportive figure for Sophie. "Mrs. Sawyer, how good to see you." The woman greeted with a warm smile. "Sophie hasn't stopped talking about your visit all day. She's in the back garden with her father." Helen followed through the welcoming house, noticing the striking differences from the Albrights' old residence. Instead of the cold, impersonal decor chosen by Claudia, the environment was full of colors, with Sophie's drawings framed on the walls, photographs of happy moments, and comfortable furniture that invited relaxation. In the back garden, she found Richard and Sophie planting flowers in a flower bed. The girl, wearing comfortable clothes and sneakers, never again patent leather shoes, had dirt on her hands and a genuine smile on her face. Richard, without a suit jacket or tie, looked 10 years younger, despite his now completely grey hair. "Helen!" Sophie exclaimed upon seeing her, running to hug her without minding the dirt on her hands. "We came for tea. Daddy and I made cookies." Helen hugged the girl, moved by the transformation. Where once there was a withdrawn and fearful child, now existed a vibrant Sophie, capable of showing affection and joy without fear of repression. Richard approached, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Welcome. Sophie has been counting the days until your visit." "I brought a gift," Helen announced, handing the package to Sophie. The girl eagerly opened it, revealing a pair of colorful light-up sneakers, exactly like the ones she had wanted on that fateful day at the mall. "They're beautiful," she exclaimed, immediately sitting down to try them on. "And they're the right size. Look, Daddy, they don't pinch at all." Richard and Helen exchanged emotional glances, understanding the profound meaning of that simple moment. For Sophie, a pair of comfortable shoes represented much more than a gift. It was the affirmation of her fundamental right to comfort and well-being. While Sophie ran around the garden testing the lights of her new sneakers, Richard invited Helen to sit on the porch. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," he said sincerely. "You saved my daughter, and in a way you saved me too." "Sophie saved herself," Helen replied. Her courage to finally speak up was what made the difference. "I just helped open the doors." Richard nodded, watching his daughter play. "You know what hurts me the most? Realizing how much time we lost. Years that could have been happy, where she could have simply been a child without fear, without pain." "You have plenty of time ahead," Helen consoled. "And from what I see, you're making good use of every moment." Mrs. Zelda brought tea and the promised cookies. Sophie joined them, sitting between her father and Helen, talking animatedly about her new school, her friends, her art classes, her rediscovered passion. "I have some news," Richard announced when the conversation flowed smoothly. "We're starting a new project, a real foundation, focused on child protection and awareness about psychological abuse. It was my idea," Sophie proudly interjected. "We're going to help other children who have tight shoes." Helen smiled at the simple but powerful metaphor Sophie had created. "The New Steps Foundation," Richard explained. "The focus will be on raising awareness about subtle forms of abuse that often go unnoticed, especially in high-income families, where the appearance of perfection hides painful realities. We'd like you to be part of the advisory board," he added. "Your experience as an investigative journalist would be invaluable." "It would be an honor," Helen replied sincerely. "And speaking of journalism, I have news too. My series of reports on the case was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Congratulations," Richard exclaimed. More important than the award were the results. Since the publication, there's been a 40% increase in reports of psychological child abuse in the county. People are starting to realize that abuse isn't just what leaves visible marks. The conversation was interrupted by a call on Helen's mobile. It was Beatrice Miller. "Breaking news," the prosecutor informed after the greetings. "Claudia's criminal sentence has just been handed down. 3 years for ill treatment and psychological abuse, plus 2 for obstruction of justice and attempted bribery. No right to open regime due to the severity of the case and the attempt to flee." Helen thanked her for the information and hung up, sharing the news with Richard. "It was expected," he commented soberly, "although no sentence can truly compensate for what Sophie went through." "What happened to her foundations?" Helen asked, curious. "All closed after investigations revealed embezzlement. The legitimate projects were incorporated into other NGOs. As for the assets—" Richard paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully, aware that Sophie was listening attentively. "Let's just say justice was poetic. Most of it was confiscated for compensation and funding child protection programs." Sophie, who had been quiet during this part of the conversation, suddenly asked, "Is she still angry with me?" Richard knelt before his daughter, gently holding her hands. "Sophie, you did absolutely nothing wrong. Aunt Claudia made very bad choices and is facing the consequences of those choices. Never was it your fault." The girl nodded, processing the information. "Sometimes I still dream about her," she admitted in a low voice. "But Dr. Marianne said it's normal, and it will pass with time." Dr. Marianne is right, Helen confirmed. You're healing, Sophie. A little bit more each day. Sophie smiled, seeming satisfied with the answer, and soon asked permission to show Helen her new room. As she climbed the stairs hand in hand with the girl, Helen reflected on the extraordinary resilience of children, the ability to heal deep wounds and move forward. Sophie's room was exactly as an 8-year-old's room should be. Colourful, cozy with books, toys and many drawings. Her stark difference from the impeccable, cold, showroom-like room Claudia maintained in the mansion. Look, this is my favourite, Sophie said, showing a framed drawing on the wall. It was a simple but powerful representation, a girl breaking what looked like a shoe-shaped cage, with colourful birds flying to freedom. It was the first drawing I made after we left the courthouse, Sophie explained. Dr. Marianne said it's a symbol of my liberation. It's beautiful, Helen commented, genuinely impressed by the metaphorical depth of the child's drawing. I have another one to show you, Sophie continued, pulling Helen to her study desk. It was a more recent drawing, colourful and vibrant. It showed several children holding hands, forming a circle. In the centre, there were comfortable shoes for everyone. This is for the foundation, Sophie proudly explained. So all children can have shoes that don't hurt. Helen felt tears in her eyes, moved by the simplicity and depth of the message. Sophie had transformed her pain into purpose, her trauma into a desire to help others. It was a lesson that many adults would never learn in a lifetime. Back in the garden, while Sophie played with her new dog, a rescue mutt from the local shelter, Helen and Richard talked about the developments of the past few months. Luke, the social worker, was promoted, Helen recounted. He's coordinating a new training program for early identification of child abuse in schools. Excellent news. And Jake, the driver? He's working as a private driver for a diplomat. Much better pay and a healthier environment. Does he still keep in touch with Sophie? Yes, he comes for dinner once a month. Sophie adores him. He was truly brave, risking everything to protect her. The afternoon passed quietly, with the golden light of the sunset bathing the garden. Sophie had fallen asleep in her father's lap after all the day's excitement, her face serene and her new light-up sneakers still on her feet. She insists on sleeping with them, Richard explained with an affectionate smile. Says they scare away the nightmares. Helen observed the scene with a full heart. A truly present father, a child finally safe to simply be a child. It was a happy ending to a story that could have ended in tragedy, were it not for small decisions that changed everything. A journalist's decision to stop and observe, a driver's courage to speak, the determination of professionals who would not be intimidated by power and influence. Later, as she said goodbye, Sophie briefly woke up and hugged Helen tightly. Thank you for seeing my tight shoes, she whispered sleepily. Thank you for being so brave and teaching me so much, Helen replied, gently kissing the girl's forehead. On her way home, driving through London's illuminated streets, Helen reflected on how journalism wasn't just about reporting facts, but about truly seeing beyond appearances, perfect facades, rehearsed smiles. It was about giving a voice to those who had been silenced, about illuminating dark corners where injustices flourished away from public view. Sophie's case had transformed not only the girl's life but also Helen's. The journalist now dedicated a significant part of her work to investigating and exposing different forms of child abuse, especially those occurring in privileged environments, protected by high walls and social influence. The New Steps Foundation, still in its initial phase, was already attracting significant attention and support. Richard had found a new purpose, using his resources and connections for a genuinely important cause. And Sophie, little by little, was transforming from a victim into a symbol of hope, the girl who broke the silence and freed herself from the tight shoes that hurt her. Upon arriving at her apartment, Helen found an envelope on her table, sent by the New Dawn shelter. Inside was a collection of drawings made by sheltered children, inspired by Sophie's story, which, with due identity protection, had been shared as an example of overcoming. The drawings showed colourful and comfortable shoes, birds flying from open cages, bright suns after dark clouds. Each in its own way celebrated freedom and hope. On the cover sheet, a simple message: because all children deserve light steps and fearless hearts. Helen smiled, hanging the drawings on her wall. They were powerful reminders that, even in the darkest situations, the courage of some can bring light to many. That speaking the truth, however painful, is the first step to healing, and that sometimes the seemingly small gesture of stopping and truly seeing another's suffering can trigger profound and lasting transformations. That night, she fell asleep with a peaceful heart, dreaming of Sophie running freely in her luminous sneakers, her light steps finally free from pain, her future shining as brightly as the colorful lights that marked her path in the darkness. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Sophie and Helen's story has touched your hearts. To follow more emotional journeys like this one, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving narratives. Find it here by clicking to the left of the video. If this story stirred emotions in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. We bring unique stories daily that explore the complexity of life and make us reflect on our role in society. And don't forget, sometimes the simple act of paying attention can change an entire life. We look forward to reading your comments and knowing what this story awakened in you. Until next time.